I've been struggling a little bit about how to respond. There are so many dials in the conversation. One of them concerns the effectiveness of comics pages, their own medium. The other one concerns the entertainment and satisfaction value of role playing as a medium and looking at that strictly from an audience standpoint. I'm sitting at the table and this is what I'm imagining and whether I'm satisfied by that. And then there's also the author component of role playing, in which the brute fact that our dialogue is making this happen and how is involved. So there's a lot of dials to kind of keep in mind, and I don't really know if I can reconcile all of those in a brief statement. A few related points, I guess, to throw in and see if we can make relate. One of them is that comics combat is not always successful visually, and there are lots and lots and lots of cheats. Some of them I think of as legitimate cheats. A good example is some heated dialogue between two individuals on the leftmost panel in a sequence of three. And then the one of them is saying something like, "Oh yeah," or "I'd like to see you try," or something like that. And the middle panel is nothing but an enormous sound effect, "pow," with an exclamation mark. And then the third panel is the individual who just did the punching striding to the reader's right and walking. And maybe the foot of the guy that he just punched is sticking up or something like that, or there's like stars spiraling upward or something. But the idea being that you don't actually see the punch, but the dynamism, the lead up, the action, and the dynamism are all there. It's a really good example of gutter work and also symbolic work with the lettering of the sound effect and things like that. And exactly what happened is absolutely clear. So that is not a cheat necessarily as technique. Then there are cheats in which there's no indication of how anything got anywhere. We only see that so-and-so has punched so-and-so. And we only see them as effects. Now this is tricky because showing an effect is much, much more entertaining and much more satisfying than showing the lead up to the effect. There's tons and tons of how-to comics in which they show a sequence of action, like someone jumping over a car, and they'll show you just the guy landing on the other side of the car, or perhaps like two panels, one about to spring and the other one landing. And then they show the same image, but with every nuance of the jump, like an animation frame sequence. And then they say, okay, look, you're going to have to subtract from the maximal version somewhere toward the minimal version, and you have to decide where in the sequence is most visually exciting and makes the most sense for this particular page. There are plenty of artists who would be perfectly happy just to show you that final one of him landing on this side of the car that he jumped over, and that's that. And in many cases, that's fine. We would look at the dialogue, we would look at the captions, we would look at what happened in the panel beforehand, and things like that to get some idea of whether that is enough. The general argument is less is more, for a couple of reasons. One is that the reader is very, very good at editing from panel to panel, or more accurately, splicing from panel to panel. And that to cause them to do cognitive work in looking at the panel, there's something that they're perfectly capable of doing on their own, given the right information, is annoying. I think that it's technically beautiful to see an anatomical and nuanced sequence like stop motion animation frames, with a hero doing a full acrobatic flip over the car. But to tell you the truth, as a comics reader, it ain't all that much fun to read in comparison to the extremely well-placed landing shot given what has come before, and that's that. So that's just maybe a long-winded look at some of the logic that goes into whether a character can and cannot do it. Particularly when we look at the negative, which is all we see are the effects. That's what I was getting at. When are there too many things that are not set up at all and have no causal relationship except for what you have to fill in? The villain grabs this hero by the throat, and the hero feebly struggles in his grasp, and then the next thing we see the villain ray blast, another hero who's just flying in. And we have to fill in all the notion of where those heroes were and why the second guy couldn't get to him in time, or, stop the throat grab, why the first guy, did the first guy just walk up and kind of just offer their neck and say, okay, grab me here, Arrgh. What on earth? How on earth did this happen? And if you have to fill it all in, then the sense of being cheated is fairly strong, both in terms of your cognitive work. You're like, wait a minute, I'm doing a whole lot of work here. Or in terms of simply being satisfied by what's happened. Basically, the authors are telling you, that guy is such a badass. That villain is so tough. Oh, goodness. Oh, goodness. And of course, all you're really seeing are your heroes like wandering up one by one and getting flattened. And you're kind of like, not really buying this as a narrated set of events that I am enjoying as an audience member. So that's what I mean by the cheating cheats. That's why that one X-Men page that I chose by John Romita Jr. is really interesting, because I think you can see all kinds of places where they struggle to show that it wasn't a cheat, even though they only show the effects of the actions. If you look at the rubble, for example, when Peter arrives at a spot, and there's rubble there, and then we see him, falling or whatever it is, and a girder. That's right. There's the girder where he's jumping. And so he picked up the girder and smashed the rubble upward. That Storm whips it out of the area with her storm. You see that you didn't know there was more rubble falling, but Nightcrawler tells you, of course, in his little thought balloon or whatever. But you see his first teleport as an effect where he had teleported because his smoke effect is over there. And now in the foreground, you see his, on his second teleport arriving. And part of that is all handled by dialogue. The captions and the dialogue and thought balloons are extremely explicit. They're working together, they're making it work, but in my opinion, there's a little bit of a struggle to make it work, simply because at the time, the artist didn't really have the chops to completely establish those things. And I don't mean establish them by drawing in every last little detail like a battle map. I mean establish them so you see it, you see what happens, you see that, you see what happens, you see this, and then that must have been there. It's quite an interesting aspect of comic skill. This page, I think, is a wonderful illustration of the gray zone in between, we're just going to tell you what happens because, they're so awesome and they did that. And it was so tense. It was so scary. They almost didn't save the people from the rubble. Oh, no. And actually seeing that be the case, let's skip over to role-playing. And here, especially in a game like Champions, where time is extremely linear, you can do a lot of simultaneity and you can do a lot of flashbacky or that happened first across scenes. But there's no mechanism for doing that whatsoever within the scenes. And that metronomic quality of the speed chart is an interesting constraint. You could kind of see it as a comic book creative team saying, we're going to treat time during the fights as a real fixed entity. We're going to go real naturalistic with this. We're not going to let there be a whole lot of cognitive backtracking. Now, of course, you can see that can become a little bit onerous. You get to the point where, look, do we really have to see anything but the Kingpin crushing Spider-Man's wrist and Spider-Man's knees going weak and the thought balloon backing it up, telling us that he can't last much longer? What else do we need? These humongous Romita Senior panels. He was kind of a master of these 3-panel and 4-panel pages, just this fantastic stuff. Kirby was doing the same thing over with the New Guns just before that. And and Buscema had been doing that on the Silver Surfer, these enormous panels with these big old gutters, and it really works. A lot can happen in the gutters. It's the Kingpin, and we'd seen him grab him, and we don't even have to watch him wear him down and just keep him from moving simply by crushing his wrist. We're seeing the end point, and it works. Well, we're not going to do that now. We're going to go, we have to say, okay, we have to count, the panels. We have to count the phases. We got to see how much damage is done. We got to see, we got to watch his strength drain away. We can watch his endurance drain away. And it's awfully tricky in role-playing not to be forced into that onerous must show every last muscle movement, every last fire hydrant placement. We got to know how precariously those bricks are balanced if the chimney's knocked over as opposed to over there. And if you start taking that approach to the role-playing, it becomes as unfun for purposes of satisfying action as it would watching it, meticulously drawn out in that way in a comic. I'm not talking about cinema at the moment, which has its own world of cheats and techniques in this regard, and also I think has a tendency to be more easily forgiven by the viewer. Whereas here things are static enough, and also in terms of role-playing experiential enough of actually making it happen, doing it, living through the creative as well as the entertainment process, that they're actually more comparable than either is to the cinema, in my opinion. Well, let's take a look then at the role-playing. Are we just stuck? Are we just going to have to be, battle mappy and metronomic and just, grunt our way through every last little step? In which case, if so-and-so can't get to the villain in time, the only reason for that was because we knew how many hexes, and we knew how fast, and we knew how much endurance they were burning as well as just using, and they still couldn't make it in time. And I think you will discover in role-playing that pretty much never happens. And that the setup of, no, you're 100 hexes away is just as arbitrary at the beginning of the fight as it is, say, halfway through the fight. So it really isn't, techniques-wise, all that different. It may seem different, but it is not all that different simply to miss the roll and narrate it as you didn't get there in time. And that's a really good example of those two different basic schools of role-playing sequence design that I talked about. That in many cases, despite all the bells and whistles, rolling for it and then back narrating to justify it in a way that seems like the most fun, I couldn't make it to get there in time. And just saying, look, I rolled and I've failed. I've done it. But instead of missing him like a goof, I want to say that I tried really hard to get there and I just couldn't. And that's fine. Now, it is very tricky in my world of design to try to not do either. I don't want merely to metronome our way through it and battle map our way through it and recognize from the beginning that the way that the whole map and the way you get here when this starts happening really is just as manipulative as anything else. There's nothing objective about that kind of play, despite all of the seeming that it is, and the claims and the self-congratulation that it was handled objectively, when the framing of it all and much of its content are indeed being covertly altered or set up in ways for certain specific tensions to be available. Okay, so what do you do in my situation when I don't want to do that, nor do I really want to just do the, things like With Great Power, the current edition, and quite a bit of other recent play and design tends to very much fall in the, well, we rolled it and now we're going to back narrate a little bit, and basically it's not that much different than introducing a very single hard constraint. This happens. And then everything else can just get, kind of tacked on as needed from there. If you like doing that, that's fine too. They both work. They both work with particular unspoken sub-techniques. Well, let's take a look at what I'm trying to do instead, which is to say, in the moment, I burn more endurance. In the moment, I try harder. In the moment, I throw in this presence attack. In the moment, I'm going to change up the way everything relates, particularly at the cost to my body, my actual physical well-being, and particularly at the emotional level. When we tap into the emotions that are running rampant in this combat, and we are able to actually make that into a causal effect in some way. And having those in place goes a long way, particularly when everybody is sucking wind on endurance, the villain included, and particularly when characters really want something. Okay, so I'm working on that. To take it to some of the better examples from the comics, I picked a couple from, that are visible in the article. I particularly like John Buscema's treatment of combat with the Silver Surfer. The combat with Thor in the Silver Surfer title is a classic of momentum, of positioning at extraordinarily long distances, of genuinely godly combat. And a great deal of it has to do with knowing which way the characters are zooming, which is quite a feat considering that you cannot draw, a spacescape, an orbital view. You can't draw that. Well, I should probably not just rhapsodize about comics pages that I happen to like. Probably the more effective approach is to say, be judgmental toward the comic pages you're looking at. You can, it's fair to say this one's bad, this one's a cheat, this one's, really clever in the way that it got me to work in what's happening. And of course, that's not a cheat, that's technique. And then this one perhaps is clear, but is overly detailed. And the person obviously, gave themselves a nervous breakdown writing down every last little way that this kind of thing could happen. All right, I got a little interrupted there for a moment. Probably lost my sequence of thought. Probably was wandering around a little bit in the first place. So let's try to wrap this up. Contingency is what we're talking about. Contingency, contingency, contingency. Even though we are observing what did happen, or determining what did happen, or both in the case of role-playing, the experience of it needs to have that component of it might not have happened that way. And in the case of narrative media, such as comics and TV and cinema and novels and all that sort of thing, it is all a matter of justification. Whereas in role-playing, the determinant moment is actually part of the experience, the social experience of doing it. What's neat is that in the narrative media, there was also that indeterminate time when the author had not actually quite arrived at what was going to happen. So we're capturing that invisible moment and dealing with it quite visibly, as I've talked about in the phenomenology videos. Well, that's what we're really talking about here, the contingency. And when is it fun? When is it fun and when is it my character can't do that? Oh, you can't do that yet. You can't do that yet. You can't do that yet. Whether it's arbitrary, somebody's just telling you that, or equally arbitrary in that you're looking at this little set of pages and numbers and points and how much you can move, and it says you can't do that either. So it's quite interesting. We need contingency, but we also need agency. And that is what I'm working on right now in this interesting constraint of a more linear, more metronomic approach to the mechanics. A big piece of that is found in my Circle of Hands game when you can change up the order with the expenditure of energy, and particularly consequential energy. You can also, in Champions, do some interesting things with, I can hold the action, I can delay the action and whatever, but it's not a freebie. There are big limits on just what you can do. Shifting to the defense is a huge part of that. Trying to keep play dynamic in that regard, and not just with everybody standing around with held actions, turning the whole thing into arbitrary decisions and roll-offs because everybody's holding action and kind of like, they're in a defensive crouch and in a kind of triggered, I'll go if he does this kind of way. Going too far in that direction completely obviates the meaning of that chart in the first place. So anyway, I'm playing with that stuff and very much have it in mind as we continue to work our way through the actual sessions.